Initially, I had no intention of talking about cases until later episodes, but I think that cases are like the elephant in the room that you simply cannot avoid. In fact, to me, cases are like the gatekeeper to the Russian language, the thing that stands between me and fluency. Of course, there are many challenges to learning Russian, but for an English speaker, the worst has got to be cases. In fact, I think that trying to memorize all the Russian cases at once was probably one of the biggest mistakes I made while learning Russian. I could have saved myself a lot of frustration. So, in this episode, I want to talk about how cases can feel overwhelming, how it's too much information at once, and the importance of understanding their purpose so they're not just random endings that make no sense to you. One of the things that did help me, though, was understanding why they exist. I mean, other than just to torture us. I always will remember the example that was given to me to help understand. And the sentence was, people eat oranges. Now, in English, the order of the words tells us everything we need to know about the sentence. We know that people are doing the action of eating, and the oranges are the object that's being eaten. But Russian doesn't work that way. Word order is more fluid and flexible in Russian. So to a Russian speaker, changing the word order to say oranges eat people would not change the meaning. But clearly in English, this is a very different, if not terrifying, sentence. So if they don't use order to identify the subject and the direct object, how do they know which one is which? Cases. That's what they do. They identify what role each word in a sentence plays. So in Russian, "Люди едят апельсины" means people eat oranges. But so does "апельсины едят людей." And it's because "люди" is in nominative case in both sentences. So even though they may be super frustrating to deal with as an English speaker, cases do serve a purpose. Once I understood why I needed them, I again focused on trying to memorize not only the endings, but when to use each case. But unfortunately, it was simply still too much information, and I again failed miserably at memorizing them. But the thing is, knowing their purpose and understanding them are two very different things. The problem wasn't that I was incapable of learning cases. The problem was that I was trying to memorize patterns before I actually understood the concepts. One thing that I did start doing when I felt frustrated with grammar was stop thinking about grammar altogether. I would switch my focus to learning new vocabulary instead. Of course, eventually I would go back and look at the grammar again, and honestly, I always found some of it was easier to understand. Of course, not all of it, maybe not even most of it, but some of it. I did this many times. I stopped learning grammar, but continued to learn new vocabulary and practice listening skills. Every time it seemed a little bit easier when I returned to the grammar at a later time. Plus, it also helped me learn a lot of new vocabulary because, well, I was frustrated with grammar quite often. I purchased a book early on. It's called The New Penguin Russian Course, a complete course for beginners. And to be honest, it's probably the best overall course. Like if you could only have one resource, this book would be it. But at the beginning, it was way too much for me, and I ended up not using it at all. About a year later, I returned to the book, and it made so much more sense. Now it was useful, where before it was not. I kept reading until it would start to become too much again, and then, like before, I would just stop, wait a few months, and start again. Because even though it is a great course, dumping too much new information into your brain before you're ready is simply just a waste of time. I'm still working my way through that book. I have not finished that book, but every time I go back to it and a little bit more makes sense, It's a feeling of achievement. I think when it comes to cases, most people will start with sort of prepositional, and it is the more simple case. It's pretty straightforward. You know if you're going to use in or on, you're going to use prepositional case, or if you're going to use about. Now, of course, there's some tricks to that because we're not always going to be using the and na to mean at a location. Sometimes we mean it more as to a location, which then becomes accusative. But for the most part, I think prepositional is a good place to start. I still think, though, that genitive was the first case I was able to attach meaning to. Well, I mean, genitive has many different uses, but I'm referring to the replacing of the English word of. For example, in English, if I said I was going to a museum, you might ask, what museum? And I might say, the Museum of History. In Russian, putting the word history in genitive case is like saying of history. The ending stopped feeling random once they represented an actual concept in my brain. Of course, I still struggled to remember them. Understanding helped, but it was still too much information at once. It took a long time for me to step back and just look at one case at a time. And that's what made a difference. Well, maybe not a huge difference, but at least there was some improvement. If I could restart learning Russian from the beginning, I would actually start with a lot of vocabulary first. And then, of course, I would learn the prepositional case. After prepositional, I would go right into accusative inanimate because of that connection between place and direction. After that, I would add in genitive, and then I would return to accusative to do the animate. One thing I would definitely say is that I wouldn't recommend worrying about plural at the beginning. Just focus on singular nouns and modifiers. In fact, genitive plural I still struggle with. And when I hit genitive plural, that was one of those times where I had to step away from grammar for a little while because everything was making so much sense and everything was moving along really smoothly for a little while. And then I hit genitive plural and I felt like I was back at square one. I'm also still working on dative and instrumental cases, but you would be amazed how much you can say with just the other four cases. If Russian cases feels impossible to you, I completely understand. But honestly, I think the biggest mistake you can make is trying to learn them as isolated endings instead of meaningful concepts. In fact, I now try to focus on learning phrases instead of individual words. That way, you're learning the words with the endings. It is a much more natural way of learning, in my opinion. Now, I had stated before that I wanted to share some resources on this podcast, resources that I found extremely helpful. And one of them was something called Russian from Zero to Fluency. And the professor that teaches that is Daria. And I had seen her videos on YouTube, and they were very helpful. She went into little details with pronunciation, etc. I had also listened to her podcasts, which she has that's called Slow Russian. When I decided to take her course, I had already been studying Russian for 2 years, but I still decided to take it from the very beginning. So she offers it in 3 different levels, and even though I knew enough to probably jump right to the 3rd level, I wanted to go back and start from the beginning in the right way. And it was through her that I finally started to understand some of these cases. And the path of the course is a very natural path. You start off with the prepositional case, then you add in the accusative, then she teaches you some genitive, and then goes back to the accusative. Basically, the whole reason why I recommended that order was because of the results I got from taking her 3 classes. Now, I do wish that she created a few more courses because she stops after genitive and doesn't get to instrumental or dative. And she's such a good teacher when it comes to teaching cases very sort of naturally, little bits of information at a time. So I really do hope, Daria, if you're out there and you ever hear this, please make more courses. So her course is something I would highly recommend. It's sort of self-paced. It's videos, quizzes, some tests, and the materials given to you. You can do it on your own time. For me, I went through very quickly because, as I said, I had already been studying Russian for 2 years. I probably did all 3 courses in under 6 weeks. But as I said, I already had a huge base. I was just picking up little details as I went along, and the vocabulary was already known to me, so it made it much easier. So whether you're quite a far into your language journey or you're just starting out, I highly recommend her course, and I recommend taking it from the very beginning. So, as we move along in this podcast, I want to share things like this, some of the resources or things that I found super helpful, whether it be websites or online courses or blogs for listening to. And it took me a long time to find everything. So I thought, it'd be really nice to have all that information together in one place. I definitely wish I had had all of the information at the very beginning. So thank you for listening today to Russian One Mistake at a Time. And I hope you will continue to spend your time with me as we learn Russian together and share our frustrations.